The Last Witness, a World War II story. You want to know about the war. I can see it in your eyes. That curiosity, that hunger for something real. Something that isn't a textbook page or a Hollywood movie. Well, I'm going to give you something better than that. I'm going to give you the truth. And the truth, I'll warn you right now, is not always clean. It doesn't always have a hero's music playing behind it. Sometimes it just smells like mud and smoke and fear. My name is Harold Eugene Mercer. I am 94 years old. I was born in Dayton, Ohio on a Tuesday morning in 1931, and I have lived long enough to watch the whole world change more times than I can count. I've outlived 3 of my closest friends, 2 of my brothers, and a war that swallowed 60 million people whole. 60 million. Let that sit with you for just a moment. 60 million human beings in mothers, fathers, children, teachers, farmers, boys, barely old enough to shave, gone because of one war, one single catastrophic moment in human history that I didn't just read about in a library. I lived it, I breathed it, I survived it, and for as long as I have breath in this old body, I'm going to make sure you know what it was really like. So pull your chair a little closer. We're going back. I was 8 years old when the war in Europe started. September 1939. I remember my father sitting at the kitchen table with the radio turned up so loud, my mother kept asking him to lower the volume. He never did. He just sat there, leaning forward on his elbows, listening to that voice crackling through the static. Hitler had invaded Poland. In 2 days, Britain and France declared war on Germany. And somewhere across an ocean I'd never seen, the world began to bleed. My father had fought in the First World War. He didn't talk about it much. Most men who'd been through that particular nightmare didn't. But I could see something shift in his face that September evening. Something behind his eyes went quiet and cold. He looked at me and my brothers sitting at the dinner table, and I swear I saw him counting our ages in his head, measuring us against the calendar, wondering how long before the fire crossed the water. He was right to wonder. We were a regular American family in a regular American city. We didn't think much about Europe back then, not really. We had our own troubles. The Great Depression had only just loosened its grip on us. My father worked at a machine shop. My mother took in laundry. We weren't poor, but we weren't far from it either. On Saturday afternoons, my brothers and I used to sneak into the movie theater through the back door and watch newsreels before the main picture. That's how I first saw images of Adolf Hitler, standing at a podium, screaming into a microphone, tens of thousands of arms shooting up around him like a forest of terrible salutes. I didn't understand it then, but I felt it. Even at 8 years old, sitting in that dark theater with popcorn in my lap, I felt something cold settle in the pit of my stomach. That man on the screen was not performing. He wasn't acting. He believed every single word he was saying, and the people around him believed it too. That is the thing about evil that nobody tells you. It doesn't announce itself as evil. It announces itself as salvation. For 2 years, the war stayed on the other side of the world, and we tried to pretend our lives were normal. We went to school. We played baseball in the summer. We listened to Jack Benny on the radio on Sunday nights. But the war crept into everything like smoke under a door. Rationing began. Sugar first, then butter, then gasoline. I remember my mother carefully rolling the tin foil from sticks of gum into little balls to donate to the scrap drives. Every bit of metal mattered. Every rubber tire mattered. The whole country was quietly, slowly mobilizing. Though most of us didn't fully understand that yet. Then came December 7th, 1941. I was 10 years old, and it was a Sunday morning, and I was throwing a football in the front yard with my brother Danny when our neighbor Mrs. Kowalski came running out of her house in her house dress, her hair still in pin curls, screaming that we'd been attacked. Her husband came out right behind her, told us to get inside and turn on the radio. That was how we found out. That crackling voice again, cutting through Sunday morning, quiet like a knife. Pearl Harbor. 2,403 Americans killed in less than 2 hours. 18 ships sunk or damaged, nearly 300 aircraft destroyed. And just like that, the war that had been on the other side of the world was suddenly our war too. I remember running inside and finding my father already at the radio. He looked up at me when I came through the door, and for the first time in my life my father looked afraid. This strong, quiet, unbreakable man, afraid. That frightened me more than anything I'd heard on the radio, because I understood in that moment that whatever was coming, it was bigger than anything we'd faced before. The next day, we all crowded around the school gymnasium radio to hear President Roosevelt address Congress. His voice was calm and steady and furious all at once. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Every child in that gymnasium went completely silent, even the boys who never stopped talking, even the ones who picked fights and threw spitballs and didn't take anything seriously. We all sat perfectly still and listened, because somehow, even at 10 years old, we understood that our childhood was ending. Over the next 2 years, the war consumed everything. My cousin Gerald enlisted at 17 by lying about his age. My father tried to re-enlist but was turned away. Too old, bad knee. He spent the rest of the war working double shifts at the machine shop making parts for military vehicles. My mother joined a local women's volunteer group, rolling bandages and knitting socks. My older brother Danny turned 18 in the spring of 1943 and was drafted 3 weeks after his birthday. The morning Danny left, my mother stood at the kitchen sink and washed the same cup 4 times. She didn't cry, not in front of us. She just stood there washing that cup over and over, her back to the room, her shoulders absolutely still. I think that image has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from those years. That particular kind of grief, the kind that's so deep and so terrified that it can't even become tears yet. Danny was sent to England first. He wrote us letters, carefully worded letters because the military censors would cut out anything sensitive. But even through the censorship, I could feel him changing. The Danny who wrote to us from England wasn't quite the same Danny who'd left Dayton with a duffel bag and a nervous grin. Something in his writing was more careful, more measured, like he was choosing every word not just for the censors, but for us, protecting us from something he'd already seen. In June of 1944, we got a letter that simply said, "I'm okay. I can't tell you where I am or what's happening, but I'm okay. I love you all. Don't worry." We found out later that he'd been at Normandy. D-Day, June 6th, 1944. The largest seaborne invasion in human history. 156,000 Allied troops crossing the English Channel in the dark of night and stepping out onto 5 beaches in occupied France, straight into the guns of the German army. More than 4,000 Allied soldiers died that day, 4,000 in a single day, on a beach, trying to gain a few miles of sand. Danny survived, but I know he left something behind in those waters that he never fully got back. When he finally came home 2 years later, he was 20 years old and had the eyes of a much older man. He'd seen things that no human being should have to see. He never really talked about it. Not to me, not to anyone. He just came home, got a job at the post office, married a girl named Ruth, and quietly built a life as far from that beach as he possibly could. That was its own kind of courage, the kind that doesn't get medals. Now, I need to tell you about what was happening in Europe, because I think a lot of people know the broad strokes of World War II, but they don't truly understand the texture of it, the smell and the weight and the darkness of it. Let me take you to Germany in the late 1930s. Before the war started, before the bombs under Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, an entire nation had been systematically taught to hate. Not just dislike, not just distrust, but to genuinely, deeply, murderously hate an entire group of people. Jewish people, primarily, but also Roma, disabled people, political opponents, gay men and women, Jehovah's Witnesses. Anyone the Nazis decided did not fit their vision of a perfect Germany. This didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly. First, it was laws. Jewish people couldn't own businesses, couldn't marry non-Jewish Germans, couldn't attend certain schools. Then it was public humiliation and forced to wear yellow stars on their clothing, forced to scrub the streets while crowds watched and laughed. Then it was violence. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass in November 1938, when Nazi mobs attacked and burned synagogues and Jewish businesses across Germany and Austria, while police stood by and watched. More than 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. About 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, and the world watched and did very little. That is the part of history that I think about the most in my darker moments, the watching, the knowing and the looking away, because by the time the world finally acted, 6 million Jewish people were dead, murdered systematically, industrially, in a machinery of death so organized and so deliberate that even today, 80 years later, the mind struggles to accept that human beings built it. 6 million. And those were just the Jewish victims. Total victims of the Nazi regime numbered 11 million. 11 million people murdered, not in the chaos of battle, but in cold, calculated programs of extermination. I have visited those places. After the war, as a young man, I went to Europe with my father, and we stood in one of those camps at Dachau in Germany. I won't try to describe it fully because I don't believe words can carry that weight. But I'll tell you this, the silence of that place was unlike any silence I've ever experienced. It wasn't peaceful, quiet. It was the kind of silence that presses against your chest, the kind that has a sound. I stood there for almost an hour and I could not move. And my father, this man who had survived one world war and worked his hands to the bone for 20 years, this man who did not cry, he bent his head and wept like a child. We must never, ever let ourselves forget what human beings are capable of doing to one another when hatred is given permission. Let me tell you about the Pacific too, because while Europe was burning, a completely different, equally brutal war was happening on the other side of the world. Japan had been at war since the mid-1930s, attacking China, seizing territory across Asia and the Pacific. When Pearl Harbor brought America into the conflict, suddenly this vast ocean theater became part of our war too. And fighting in the Pacific was a completely different experience from fighting in Europe. The terrain was different. Dense jungles, tropical islands, oppressive heat that could kill a man as surely as a bullet. The distances were enormous, and the Japanese military, fighting under a code of warrior honor that forbade surrender, fought with a ferocity and a willingness to die that American soldiers hadn't encountered in Europe. My father's friend, a man named Carl, who worked at the machine shop, had a son named Mickey, who fought in the Pacific. Mickey wrote home about the islands, about the jungle heat that soaked through everything and never let your skin dry, about the insects and the disease, about fighting an enemy who would rather die than give up a single inch of ground. At Iwo Jima in February of 1945, 6,800 Americans died to take a small volcanic island. The battle lasted 36 days. That famous photograph, the Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi, was taken there. When I see that image, I don't just see heroism. I see exhaustion. I see the weight of what those men had already been through and what they still had to face. Mickey came home from the Pacific, but he came home with malaria and something else that we didn't have a name for back then. We called it shell shock or battle fatigue. Now we call it PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Whatever you call it, it is the wound that doesn't show on the outside, the war that keeps going inside a man's mind long after the shooting stops. So many of the men who came home from World War II carried that wound with them for the rest of their lives. And because they were the greatest generation, because they were supposed to be tough and stoic and unbreakable, most of them suffered in silence. They drank too much or worked too hard or sat too long in quiet rooms, staring at things that weren't there. Nobody got treatment, nobody got counseling. They just got a parade and then a job and a wife and a mortgage and were expected to move on. We failed those men. We celebrated their victory and we forgot their suffering. That is one of my deepest regrets about my generation. Not what we did during the war, but what we failed to do for our soldiers afterward. Let me tell you about the summer of 1945, the summer the war ended, because I was 14 years old that summer, and I remember it with perfect clarity, every detail sharp as cut glass. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing. Hitler's army was being crushed between the Allied forces advancing from the west and the Soviet army advancing from the east. Berlin, that great city that had been the heart of the Nazi Empire, was being reduced to rubble. People were living in basements and bomb shelters, surviving on almost nothing. The whole edifice of a nation that had tried to conquer the world was falling in on itself. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself in a bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin. The man who had launched the most destructive war in human history, who had ordered the murder of millions, died hiding underground like a rat. A week later, on May 8th, Germany surrendered. DDay, victory in Europe. I remember the streets of Dayton that night. We poured out of our houses, right, all of us, the whole neighborhood, the whole city, it seemed. People were crying and laughing at the same time. Strangers were hugging each other. Someone drove their car down our street, honking the horn for 10 solid minutes, and nobody cared. The church bells were ringing. My mother finally cried. All the tears she'd been holding for 3 years came out at once, standing on our front porch in the warm May evening, crying so hard her whole body shook. Danny wasn't home yet. He was still in Europe, part of the occupation force. But he was alive. He was alive, and the killing was stopping. And my mother stood on that porch and cried like the whole weight of the world was lifting off her shoulders. But the war wasn't over, not yet. Japan still refused to surrender. And the cost of invading the Japanese home islands, military planners estimated it could cost 1 million American casualties. 1 million. After everything that had already been lost after 6 years of global war, the thought of another 1 million dead was unbearable. In early August, I was lying on the grass in the backyard listening to the radio through an open window when my father came outside and sat down in his lawn chair and said very quietly that we had dropped an entirely new kind of bomb on Japan, a bomb unlike anything that had ever been built before. One bomb on the city of Hiroshima. I didn't understand at first. One bomb. I'd heard about the bombing campaigns over Germany, hundreds of planes dropping hundreds of bombs to destroy a city. How could one bomb, change anything? Then he told me what had happened to Hiroshima, and I went very quiet. An atomic bomb dropped from a single airplane had destroyed 4.5 square miles of that city in an instant. 70 to 80,000 people dead immediately, another 70,000 injured, an entire city, buildings, bridges, hospitals, schools, markets, homes, simply gone. In one flash of unimaginable heat and light. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki, another 65,000 dead. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. VJ Day, victory over Japan. The war was over. The celebrations were enormous, bigger than VE Day, if that was even possible. Times Square in New York, with that famous photograph of the sailor kissing the nurse, that explosion of pure, uncontrollable joy in the streets, that was real. That wasn't staged or posed. That was what the end of the war felt like. It felt like every single person in America exhaled at exactly the same moment after holding their breath for 4 years. But here is what I want you to understand, and this is important. The ending of the war was also the beginning of a very complicated reckoning. The atomic bombs had ended the war, yes. And they had spared the lives of potentially hundreds of thousands of American soldiers who would have died in an invasion of Japan. But they had also killed over 100,000 civilians in an instant and left tens of thousands more to die slowly from radiation sickness in the weeks and months that followed. Men, women, and children who had nothing to do with the decisions of their government. Ordinary people who woke up on an ordinary morning and were simply gone by noon. I have wrestled with that question my entire life. I was 14 and I cheered when Japan surrendered, and I meant it. I was so relieved, we all were. But I have never been fully at peace with the cost of that relief. War forces terrible choices on human beings, choices where every option has a body count. And anyone who tells you those choices are simple is either lying to you or has never truly looked at the price tag. The world that emerged from World War II was completely different from the world that had gone in. Europe was shattered. Entire cities looked like the surface of the moon, miles of rubble where neighborhoods had stood. 50 million Europeans were displaced, homeless, stateless. The map had to be redrawn, borders moved, governments rebuilt from scratch. In Germany, the trials at Nuremberg put the surviving Nazi leadership on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. For the first time in history, the idea was formally established that certain acts, genocide, mass murder, the deliberate targeting of civilians, are not legitimate acts of war or government policy. They are crimes, and the individuals who commit them, no matter how high their rank, are personally responsible. That was important. That mattered. The world said, we will not simply move on and pretend. We will look at what was done, speak its name clearly, and hold the people who did it accountable. The United Nations was founded. The Declaration of Human Rights was written. Israel was established as a homeland for Jewish people who had been scattered and slaughtered across Europe. The world was trying, imperfectly, messily, incompletely, to build something better than what had come before. And here at home, things were changing too. The African-American soldiers who had fought and died for their country came home to a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. They had defeated fascism overseas and came back to Jim Crow laws and segregation at home. The injustice of that was impossible to ignore, and many historians believe that World War II planted seeds that would eventually grow into the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. When you have fought for freedom, you cannot accept its absence in your own backyard. Those men and women refused to. Japanese Americans, over 120,000 of them, had been forced into internment camps right here in the United States, their own country after Pearl Harbor, simply because of their ancestry. Many lost everything: homes, businesses, farms, savings gone. And many of their sons served with extraordinary distinction in the U.S. Army, even while their families sat behind barbed wire. That is one of the most shameful chapters in American history, and one that took decades for our government to formally acknowledge and apologize for. The war held up a mirror to America, and some of what we saw was heroic, and some of it was not. The measure of a great nation is not that it never fails its values, it's that it eventually faces those failures honestly. I am 94 years old, and I am sitting here in this chair talking to you today, and I can tell you this. I have lived a long and full life. I have known love and loss and joy and grief. I have watched men walk on the moon. I have seen the Berlin Wall fall. I have seen the internet change everything I thought I understood about human connection. I have granddaughters who carry the whole world in their pockets on little glass screens. But nothing has shaped my understanding of life and human nature as deeply as the years I spent growing up in the shadow of World War II. Because here is what that war taught me that no school can fully teach and no movie can fully show. It taught me how thin the line is, how quickly civilization, real civilization, the kind built over centuries with art and music and law and compassion, can be dismantled. It does not take an invasion. It does not take a foreign enemy. All it takes is a population willing to look away while their leaders spread fear and hatred. All it takes is enough people telling themselves that it isn't their problem, or that things aren't really that bad, or that surely someone else will speak up. Hitler did not seize power in Germany overnight. He was elected. He used democracy's own tools against it, slowly, methodically, normalizing each step of extremism before taking the next one. By the time most people understood what was happening, the machinery of terror was already too powerful to stop without a world war that killed 60 million people. Think about that. 60 million people because the world waited too long to take hatred seriously. It taught me about courage too, not the Hollywood kind, not the dramatic charge across the battlefield with music swelling, the real kind, the quiet, grinding, daily courage of ordinary people doing impossible things because there was simply no one else to do them. The French resistance fighters hiding Jewish families in their basements, the American medics who ran into gunfire carrying nothing but bandages, the women working in factories who had never held a wrench in their lives and became the backbone of the war effort while their husbands were overseas, the soldiers who were terrified every single day and went forward anyway. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is being absolutely terrified and moving forward because something matters more than your fear. It taught me about the price of peace. People my grandchildren's age have grown up in a world where war between major European powers seems almost unimaginable, where the horrors I've described tonight feel like ancient history. And I'm glad for that. I am genuinely glad that they can barely conceive of it. But I worry too, because when the price of peace is forgotten, people stop paying it. They stop doing the difficult, boring, necessary work of building institutions and treaties and alliances that keep the guns quiet. They start thinking that peace is the natural state of things, that it maintains itself, that someone else is taking care of it. Peace is not the natural state of things. The natural state of things is that the strong take from the weak whenever they can. Peace is a structure that human beings build and maintain with enormous effort, generation after generation, and it requires constant tending. My Danny is gone now. He passed in 2019 at 95 years old, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. At his funeral, his grandson, as a tall kid named Marcus, 22 years old, came up to me afterward and asked me if Grandpa had really been at Normandy. I told him yes. He said he couldn't imagine it. I told him that was the point, that we fought that war so he would never have to be able to imagine it from personal experience. But I told Marcus one more thing, and I'll tell it to you now because it's the most important thing I know. The generation that survived World War II did not survive by being smarter or braver or more special than any other generation. They survived, and they won because they woke up. They looked at what was happening in the world, they understood the stakes, and they made the choice collectively, as a civilization, to stand up and say, no, not this, not on our watch. That choice is always available to every generation, including yours. I have watched this world change for 94 years. I have seen the worst things human beings can do to one another, and I have also seen the absolute best, the courage, the sacrifice, the stubbornness of the human spirit that refuses to be extinguished no matter how dark things get. I have seen how quickly things can fall apart, and I have seen how magnificently they can be rebuilt. The men and women of my generation did not want to fight a world war. They wanted to live normal lives. They wanted to fall in love and raise children and worry about nothing more serious than whether it would rain on the weekend. The war came to them anyway, and they answered. They answered with everything they had. They are almost all gone now, the last witnesses, the last living memories. And when they are gone, when I am gone, the only thing left will be what they passed on. The stories, the photographs, the lessons written in blood and sacrifice and extraordinary human determination. So don't let it fade. Don't let it become just a chapter in a textbook that you skim before the exam. Read the names, walk through those memorials, ask yourself what 60 million human lives looked like, felt like, laughed like, dreamed like before they were taken. And ask yourself what you would have done, what you will do, what you are doing right now to tend the peace that so many people died to give you. I am 94 years old. I am tired, and my bones hurt, and I have more yesterdays than tomorrows. But I am here, and I am talking to you, because you are the reason I kept talking. You are the reason all of us who witnessed those years kept telling these stories long after we wanted to stop. Because you are the future we were fighting for. You are what the whole terrible, magnificent, heartbreaking story was for. Don't waste it. Don't you dare waste it.